Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be starting one of the hottest debates that happens in today's conjuncture, geopolitics, namely what is happening with the energy order, the way we saw it, the way it was set for many years ago, and can we, from that situation, anticipate that a new energy order will emerge from the current crisis. So before going into the topic, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists. Almost all are energy professionals, geopolitics professionals, former foreign ministers, and you name it. So we have a very diversified panel. And what I'd like to do before introducing the topic is obviously to introduce our panelists. We'll try to speak English because we got the majority of the panelists that are English speakers, and I want to make sure that our French participants will be addressed in French. So basically, I'd like to start from right to left. We have Mr. Alexandre Kateb, economist and consultant in finance and strategy. You obviously teach also at Sciences Po, and you're expert on the MENA region and the economics, global economics, and how it affects the MENA region. We have expert from industry. So we have obviously Mr. Hubert, who represents one of the major players in the energy sector, namely ENGIE. And we'd be happy to discuss the issue and the topic with what ENGIE is doing. You're also an academic, so that will be interesting to see, in Morocco, by the way, to see what kind of issues or learnings can be done from the crisis. We have Professor Long, who I like to call the elephant in the room, because it's essentially China and the role of China in the current and the future energy order that we all would like to have an idea from you and from the role that China is playing. To my left, I have Dr. Peter Balas, former foreign minister of Hungary, so an interesting country, and obviously in the current configuration, and obviously you've been EU commissioner and you're executive in an EU framework in Brussels. So welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Kamal, who's from Egypt. So we look forward to look at Egypt's role in coming days. All eyes will be focused on Egypt. You're obviously a seasoned professional in the oil and gas sector, and we'll look at how the energy supply and energy logistics are reflected in the strategic positioning of Egypt in both logistics and obviously climate issue. We are very happy to welcome a speaker from Argentina, and we have Dr. Carola Beatriz Ramon, who's the Undersecretary of the Federal Planning at the Ministry of Argentina, Argentine Republic. So we look forward to have a view from countries in the south that obviously I cannot represent today, so I'll pass the buck on the perspective from Latin America, and I'm very pleased for that matter. We have Mr. Joseph Monical, who's the Secretary General of the International Energy Forum, and he comes from the United States. Joseph has an extensive experience as Chief of Staff of the DOE some 20 years ago when Secretary of Energy Spencer Abraham actually visited Morocco on the USA-Africa Energy Forum. So it will be interesting to see the role, the critical role that the US has played from the very beginning of the energy order, when energy was not available where it was needed, and we're going to discuss all these issues accordingly. He's based in Saudi Arabia. The International Energy Forum is based in Saudi Arabia, so we look forward to have that perspective in the current debate. Next to him, we have the private sector that is represented by Mr. Fabrice Sorry, I'm still looking at, I'm searching. So you obviously represent, you were active at Veolia, and you're going to obviously enlighten us on the importance of the new economy, you know, energy transition, public partnerships, obviously huge investments needed, and therefore we look forward to your experience on that issue. On his left, we have Mr. Andreas Kremer, the founder of the Ecologic Institut, initially at Berlin, and I realized that you've spread globally. You were obviously also lecturer at MIT, and we look forward to see how Germany has actually impacted the global energy order, on how it was exploited, at least. Next to him, we have Elena Gonzalez, who's a major player in a company which is called Acciona, 15 kilometers away from our shores, a major company in energy, renewable energy services. So that would be interesting to see how solutions and what kind of requirements will be needed for a transition, as inclusive as possible. To her left, we have Mr. Favnek, so an expert on energy geopolitics, and you've obviously just wrote a book, and we look forward to see, you know, what kind of changes have come since you've published it in early 2022 this year. And last but not least, Dr. Utusen, who will provide us with the perspective of both futures and future perspective. How do you address future on critical issues such as energy and other commodities that are traded globally? And you obviously come from the background of the World Energy Council, that you also represent precisely on this topic. So now that I have presented my speakers, I'd like to just address in a minute or so the topic of new global order, new energy order. Obviously, we come from a situation where, for the first time, you had, briefly in the last 100, 150 years, first industrial revolution, the coal was available where it was needed. It led to the industrialization of the major powers that are today on the table, with the emergence of new ones, obviously. And for the first time, you had a transition in the early 20th century from coal to oil. And for the first time, Churchill acknowledged that we had an issue because the energy supply was not available where it was needed, and therefore the whole tantra of energy security, not one supplier, not one supply route, and we've seen how things have unfolded in the last century. And as soon as you have an energy transition, you obviously have a war over dominance, over the access to these resources, because if you control this resource, you control essentially the world. Energy is so central to our economies, that is obvious. We've seen how the second energy transition, which happened essentially, it was kicked in the early 70s, 1973, was not really the Kippur War that triggered it. It was the fact that the US, the largest player in energy, largest oil producer and consumer, was reaching its peak. So therefore, it launched a huge debate over the future uncertainty. And we've seen afterwards, obviously, different crises, wars that played on the price of oil globally and led to the downfall of empires. We're going to discuss that as well. Now we are obviously heading to the third transition with the renewables that were kicked in the early 70s. We've got now, thanks to the role of China and Germany, obviously, in the process, renewable energy are kicking in the energy transition, and we'll start to have a global strategic role. Of course, the energy transition was relying on gas. The EU has labeled natural gas as an energy transition vector, critical for the energy transition. Perfect timing for Russia to say, wait a minute, I may have something to add in that transition. And so it's interesting to see, if you cut oil supply, I just saw that this morning, the US imposed an embargo on Japan on August 1st, 1941. It took 3 months for Japan to launch a desperate war to have access to these resources. And so we can see a parallel emerging with how Russia positions itself right now in the current energy transition, and we'll see what kind of solutions and what kind of new order will emerge from that. So now that, in a nutshell, I tried to make a brief update on the situation, I'd like to turn to Joseph McMonagle from the United States, and you're based in Saudi Arabia. And so for us, what happened recently in the energy order reminded us of what happened in the 1980s with the critical strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, where essentially an agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia brought the barrel down to $12 a barrel, and we saw how that impacted actually the Soviet Union's finances. And so it was quite a surprise for us to see when that happened again, same configuration, and we thought, okay, we know the answer, you know, a phone call from Washington, and it will be all solved. Joseph, can you enlighten us on the difference that we're facing this time, and what can we expect on a response from, you know, all the energy consumers, the largest one being the United States for the moment, and what are the leads for trying to come out of what appears to be very uncertain times in the future?
Well, thank you very much, Khaled, in setting the table. It's great to be back. I was actually on that trip 20 years ago with the former Secretary of Energy for the U.S.-Africa Energy Summit in Casablanca, and it's great to be here with such an esteemed panel. As you referenced, there is this current disagreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia on oil in particular. I have to be careful here because both Saudi Arabia and the U.S. are member countries of the IEF, and both are on my executive board. And one of the things they teach you at Secretary General School is never be critical of a member country. So, so I will try to be very careful here. Look, I think, let me just give a quick update on where things stand in both oil and gas markets, since that seems to be the focus. In terms of gas, Europe, I think, is getting very lucky here with the weather, and storage has been, filled. So I think, unless there's a major cold snap, which is a possibility, I think this winter everything will be okay for Europe. However, looking at 2023 and the next successive years, I think we're looking at a much more dire situation. And I think it's important to say right here, as we're meeting in Africa, I was just in Cape Town 2 weeks ago at the Africa Energy Week. Europe's energy crisis is spreading to other parts of the world, and actually to places that are not capable or more vulnerable to cope with higher prices and volatility. So I think we have to keep that in mind. Europe is basically pricing other parts of the market out of the natural gas market. In terms of oil, which is the main focus of the U.S.-Saudi disagreement, essentially, I could kind of agree with both sides here. We're in a tale of two markets. The physical oil markets are quite tight. Saudi Arabia is actually raising prices because demand is so tight in oil markets. However, the paper markets, they are pricing in bad economic news and a recession, and then what normally follows is lower demand. So both the IEA and EIA and of course OPEC, all three of those reporting agencies are forecasting lower demand as a result of a recession and bad economic news. Supply is, our demand is already at pre-COVID levels, but supply is not yet. And the gap between supply and demand, I think most people think it's because Saudi Arabia or OPEC is just not producing enough oil, and that's not really true. Half of the supply gap is from my own country in the United States, where U.S. producers are not back to where they were producing at pre-COVID levels. And there's a whole host of reasons why: COVID uncertainty, investor pressures, ESG pressures, and now, of course, looking at the recession, bad economic news, uncertainty. I know this, Russia is going to be a major topic of this panel and at every energy conference I go to, but the only thing I would add here, just to quickly end, because I don't want to take up all the time at the beginning, is the war in Ukraine is not the root cause of today's energy crisis. And I think it would be a big mistake if policymakers and the industry and the public took that away. The root cause is really a lack of investment in upstream oil and gas, because we don't have alternatives yet for oil and gas. In order, we need much more renewables, wind and solar. But the IEA report, the technology report that came out in 2020, said wind and solar get us halfway to meeting our climate goals. The other half have to come from new technologies that are not commercialized or even invented yet.
But one question, sorry to interrupt you, Joseph. In terms of market rules, if you know that there is a recession looming, why would the oil-producing countries precisely raise the price of oil? I mean, if they want to preserve some growth, they need to have a market level and demand that can match. If you now raise the price of oil, you'll have a collapse of demand, including a major recession. What do you know?
Well, I think the reason behind that is they don't feel like they're pushing the only levers that are sort of contributing to this bad economic news. I mean, yes, oil prices, higher oil prices and volatility are certainly a headwind on economic growth. And I know producing countries know this. They obviously want a healthy world economy. They want healthy economies of their customers because they want to be able to sell more hydrocarbons. But in this case, you have central banks raising interest rates. There's a lot of factors going on here. And just to quickly come back to the Russia thing, because I don't want people to have the wrong impression here, Russia has definitely added a premium to prices and volatility, but it's not the root cause. If the war never happened or the war ended today, we would still be facing a major energy crisis here. And so that's kind of the key takeaway I want to leave people with.
Okay, quite politically correct regarding the response from Saudi Arabia to President Biden's visit to try and lower the price of oil. I'd like to bounce back now, if I may, on the role of Russia and the whole architecture post-World War II against the Soviet Union, and to see how NATO was founded in 1947 as a military cohesive bloc, and then the EU was added to it to make sure that economically Europe could withstand the pressure from the Soviet Union. And we are like astounded to see, and you're not the only country responsible for that. I was witnessing NATO. We received funding from NATO for an energy transition, and Madeleine Albright was on a panel to try to talk about the energy security of NATO countries, and the answer back then in 2009 was with the invitation of President Medvedev in Lisbon summit to say, you know, NATO-Russia partnership is the solution for NATO energy security. On the backdrop of that, obviously, Germany has made those direct link to Russia, undermining European unity over the dependency of Russia and the cohesiveness of a union that needs to be together for, you know, we're talking about an architecture of over 70 years. What is your take? How did we get there? How could Germany and how could NATO countries actually be fooled to that extent?
Thank you, Khalid, and thank you for the invitation. You've invited somebody who works in a non-profit civil society organization in Germany. I'm not a representative of the German government, which gives me the freedom to be very blunt here in a way that a government official couldn't, and admit that Germany has made a number of blunders. The most recent one, that's the one that is catching the headlines at the moment, is Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. But they come after a series of other blunders. And I would say not a blunder was the building of the strategic partnership, which we call pipes for oil, or pipes for gas with Russia, at a time when there was a legitimate expectation that the engagement with Russia would actually help the country become more integrated into the world economy, have a stake in the stability, economic and political stability of the world, this went well and it contributed to the ending of the Cold War. It went south, it went wrong when the West, including Germany, did not respond adequately to Russia's aggression in other parts of the world. And it doesn't start with Ukraine, it started with Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. We have the unresolved conflict in Transnistria, and on top of that we now have Ukraine. I will say that it was a blunder to continue blue-eyed, hopeful thinking in that policy after Russia's attack in 2014, annexing Crimea and invading part of the Donbass. This blunder continuing on that basis and building Nord Stream 2 almost to the point of getting it to deliver gas is a blunder that comes on top of other blunders in the energy sector. Let's not forget, Germany had a leading share of the global solar photovoltaic industry. Unforced errors and stupidity by government and by industry gave that away, and the industry is basically dead. We are now faced with having to rebuild the value chain, the whole supply chain of solar PV, including inverters and other components that you need in Europe. We are doing that. It will take years rather than months. We have the blunder of not killing, but misdirecting the wind power industry in Germany, which went offshore, where the financial sector wanted it and the big energy utilities wanted it. It would have been much cheaper and much quicker to continue the build-out of the industry on land, but the mistake was made in this case, argued for and forced by German industry itself, that was misguided in some way. I could also go and say that the push towards efficient diesel engines rather than favoring electric cars was also a major strategic blunder of the German car industry, and we are still reeling from the consequences of the diesel scandal, Volkswagen scandal, whatever you want to call it. Have we not made those blunders, and I include in that the extension of the running time of our nuclear power plants? If we had stuck to the phase-out schedule that was agreed between industry and government in 2000, if we'd stuck to that, and if we had not made those other blunders, we would be finished with the nuclear industry in Germany now. We wouldn't have to run the risks, and we wouldn't have to spend all the political time and capital at the moment in order to fight a rearguard action by the nuclear industry that has no business case whatsoever, not in Germany, not anywhere else, but we are still having to deal with that. All those blunders come on top of what has happened before. So the Nord Stream 2 is just the final one. But as a measure of hope now, I think everybody in Germany has understood, and with the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, which basically destroyed any hope that the gas supply could soon resume from Russia through that access straight into Germany, we now know that we have to wean ourselves off Russian gas as quickly as possible, and German households, German transport system, German industry, German government, everybody is working in the idea not of a war economy but a mission economy in order to make that happen as quickly as possible. Mistakes will be made in that process, but at least it's going in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And it's striking to see that it's actually a collective mistake from the West, because that reliance on Russia. I recall having interpelled George Herbert Walker Bush Senior, on this issue and the attitude of Germany, and he was adamant by saying, no, Germany is an ally, we stick with Germany, etc. And so he justified the German politics. So it was quite impressive to see all an architecture that was designed to prevent that was basically unraveled collectively by the West. And that struck me. And as we are talking about collective and regional blocks, I'd like to address Dr. Balázs, who obviously has had a role both in the European Commission as being the first commissioner from Hungary, and Hungary is also kind of a disruptor in Europe. At least it's perceived that way because of its relation with Russia. And we'd like to understand, how do you deal with the energy geopolitics within the EU and in the current situation? What is Hungary doing?
Thank you. We are in a deep crisis, and the political aim of everybody, mainly the importance, is to increase stability and to decrease dependency. In Europe, we have a very high degree of dependency, the share of imports in the global consumption is near to 60%. For the moment, it's 58%. It's very high. We haven't got a European energy market. We are deeply divided because various regions have different sources. Some are importing Norwegian gas, others are importing from Algeria. Then there are liquid gas importers and pipelines coming from the east, mainly from Russia. Now, the problem is, in the actual political situation, the dependency on Russia. We are depending, as Europe as a whole, in natural gas to the extent of 43% is Russia. In crude oil, 29% is Russia. Now, the attitude, and we are polarized in a way because the big majority of the EU member states have understood that we have to decrease that high degree of dependency. Germany is a very good example. I could go on with Mr. Kramer's arguments in quoting that, for instance, Germany was not prepared to receive LNG. And they have acquired within a few weeks floating storages, 2 big ships that can receive the gas and forward it to the mainland. Or a very good illustration, gas imports from Russia in Germany were decreased within 1 year from 55% to 26%. Less than the half. It's a very big turn. And as an opposite example, I can quote the country where I was born, Hungary. Hungary is sticking to the Russian sources, has asked for a waiver in the EU not to reduce crude oil imports. Partly it is understandable. Partly it is logical because there are the pipelines inherited from the past, from Soviet times, and you cannot replace them in a deeply landlocked country which has no seashore, no opportunity to change sources. But let me add the example of the Czech Republic, which is equally in a landlocked position, and they have decided to change this position and to do new investments. On mainland, you have to build so-called interconnectors between national networks in order to transfer, because in the EU, in electricity, we are interconnected and we can exchange electricity between and among countries, not for crude oil and not for gas. So now the strategic aim is to go on. I am a bit skeptical on global order because if we cannot shape a united energy market in one of the most integrated regions of the world, which is the European Union, and we cannot step up as one buyer towards Russia or any other client, how could we shape a world order where energy producers and energy suppliers are deeply divided?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ballas. That leads me to address the elephant in the room and, the country that has transformed renewable energy production and costs. And I have basically 2 questions. We have 2 steps. On the renewables, we're going to discuss that on the second stage. And obviously, we have COP27 coming up, where I'm going to ask Dr. Kamal to address this, what to expect, and the role of Egypt in representing collectively the rest of the world in this energy crisis and an environment crisis. That's another issue that obviously is underlying the speed of transition, which China hopefully will contribute to. We know that according to the last IEA report, we saw that the role of China in the renewables will be somewhat decreasing because other countries have picked up renewable energy production and manufacturing as well. So we're going to talk about logistics as well, of both oil and manufacturing logistics. We've seen how that has been disrupted with both COVID and some incidents on the Suez Canal. And so basically, according to that report, we see that Russian energy exports, which I think 75% goes to the European Union, is gradually going to decrease by 2030. And it looks like Russia will not be able to export its main commodity, energy commodity, because, according to Fatih Birol, it will take about 10 years to reorient all the Russian gas logistics to Asia, to try to send energy to Asia. So we know that there are like some talks between China and Russia on how to deal, China and the US on how to deal with the current crisis, at least on the military level. It appears that there are some contacts by preventing critical components, for example, to be shipped. So we kind of see kind of an underlying cooperation between two major powers, and it looks like in the new energy order, we have like now a new confrontation configuration, and we're very eager to see how do you see that unfold, how much collaboration do you see happening with the incumbent power and the emerging power on the global energy sector and future order?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting the elephant in the room to this august panel. China is, in fact, a very appropriate player because it's both the major part of the past problem and a major part of the future solution. Now, to put things in this context, China, when it started to grow economically, was a very, very poor country. A lot of the energy polluting industries were outsourced to China because China needed to grow its economy, relying on manufacture and relying on coal. So as time to go by and China became richer and economically more viable, there was a great deal of demand, of course, in the society for higher quality of life, pollution in the air, pollution in the river, soil, and that threatens the stability of the Chinese Communist Party. And so China has to switch to green energy as a more sustainable kind of source. So you can see that in recent years, China, in fact, is the biggest, was the biggest polluter in aggregate. No, not in per capita terms ever, because China's got 4 times the population of the United States. So on a per capita base, China has never been the biggest polluter. But in aggregate, of course, it has been the biggest polluter, and it still is because it's of the size of the economy, but not again in per capita terms. But then, apart from the kind of internal demand for high quality, there is an external, very important dynamic, which is energy security. For the West, green energy is about polar bears and clean air and so on for the children and children's children. But for China, it's national security. Why? Because China's energy import depends on transit points from the Middle East and through the Asia Pacific, through choke points controlled by, of course, the United States in the so-called Malacca Strait dilemma, and even in the port of Hormuz facing Iran, things there beyond China's control. So China has to develop new supply routes through the Belt and Road, which is, of course, China's pivot to the West, energy supply through land routes, through Middle East and through Central Asia, through Russia, and then connected with Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. So as pointed out just now, according to the latest IEA report 2022, in fact, China has been growing heavily, has been expanding heavily, the gas, which is an intermediary kind of level. But you can see that there is a gas plateau in the world, according to the IEA report, thanks to the contribution of China in that sector. And the problem lies in a mismatch between the capacity, China's got building up capacity greatly, with the deployment. But then a lot of countries are suffering from the lack of infrastructure, the lack of finance. So I think all these issues has got to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Long. Dr. Long, you're obviously also an academic amongst many other functions in the Chinese government. You know, basically, the way I see it is that we have kind of a new configuration where actually China was or is still totally reliable on its oil supply through maritime routes that are controlled, obviously, by the United States. And it looks like this current crisis may enable China to have a little strategic autonomy vis-à-vis its energy supply, and in particular with its rivalry in the United States. So it looks like in terms of new energy order, things may start to level up because of China's opportunity to become a little bit more independent in terms of its energy security situation. What do you think of that?
As I said, that according to the latest IEA report, 2022, there is a good chance that the world could make it 1%, 1 degree centigrade reduction by by the end of the century. But that's not enough to address climate change, and the whole world needs to come together to grow the kind of infrastructure. But as far as China is concerned, China still depends on energy input, although it's growing its renewable energies. For some time in the next 2 decades, China has got to rely on import of energy, particularly gas. And of course, I can see that the gas supply from Russia is not going to be to diminish all of a sudden, because the alternative are also bound up with the geopolitical kind of risks. Even sort of energy supply from the Middle East, or because of the distance, because of the various choke points, and because of the international geopolitics. So I do see that there is a source of supply from Russia, but also growing developing relationships with Arab countries, because United States has now become a net energy exporter. It's no longer rely on too much as before on the Middle East, and the Middle East is likely to view China as a good customer. But then, of course, if you address the green energies, that's not the solution. But suffice to say, China is now leading the world in solar panels, in wind farms, and other renewable energies.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. I was really talking about core strategy, energy security supply. You now have the US controlling the waters of the world with its powerful navy, and all of a sudden you have here an opportunity to get your oil supply independent from that control. What do you think of that? That's the core of my question.
Well, that's immediately to raise these two aspects. The two aspects are interrelated, because the supply of energy, gas, you got to transit, the sea routes, right? It just can't be dropped down from a helicopter, and so you depend on the safety of sea passage, sea transit, and you depend on the security of oil pipes. And I think that the major hurdle now for the world to expand the use of energy is to develop the so-called smart grids on a regional basis, because the distribution of green energy is very uneven. You've got the smart grids, and that would be a great thing. And I understand that the world is now putting more and more resources on developing smart grids, including the United States and China.
Sorry.
Technologies like quantum dots, so that solar panels can be used in houses throughout the world.
Okay, so you're basically saying the former energy order based on who controls the sea routes of oil is something of the past, and that China is more betting on developing more technology, although its oil needs, mostly from the Middle East, are quite significant. So it's a development. The jury is still out to see how any confrontation or collaboration between US and China will unfold in the future. I'd like to switch now, because we have obviously agenda constraint, with Elena Gonzalez from Acciona. We've seen how Spain in the mid-90s has started a very ambitious renewable energy support program, and this enabled, and I'd like to address the situation of countries in the south that could emulate actually the example of Spain, by enabling companies in Spain to acquire the technology. If you talk about wind technology, it was essentially from Denmark, and enabling local companies such as Acciona to be global players in the renewable energy investment, deployment. And my particular question to you, Elena, is regarding the example of Spain and countries in the south that have tremendous amount of resources. How do you see an example of countries in the south being able, or players in the south being able to develop and deploy companies such as yours, to make the energy transition more inclusive for the south? Because if it's the same players from the north that will implement renewables in the south, we're not out of the woods yet.
Thank you very much, Khalid, and a pleasure to be with all of you in this really interesting discussion. Yes, I think that we can take the example of Spain. Spain is not the main actor in the map of the US, in the map of the European Union, but it's becoming a really interesting example of how Spain is a country that, as the Hungary representative said, the European Union now has a dependency around 58% of fossil fuels, but Spain has a 74%, which is quite above what is happening in the European Union. But what is Spain doing? Spain has promoted the renewables and is trying to follow the transition plan that the European Union has established. Remember, 32% of renewable consumption, electricity consumption, 32.5 reduction of energy efficiency, and 55% of reduction of CO2 emissions. So what is the case of Spain? Spain has got finally for this year, the past year, the year 2021, we have achieved a consumption of electricity coming from the renewables of 42%. So we have achieved the goal of the European Union because we have changed our capacity installed from a typical fossil fuel generation to a 67% of production of energy without emission. That means that we have 43% of renewable, wind is 25%, and if we include photovoltaic, solar thermal, plus hydro and pumping and also nuclear, we reach the amount of 67% of energy coming from non-CO2 emissions.
Thank you very much, Elena. But you know, what you're missing here is another elephant in the room, is that you cannot reach those energy security targets without natural gas. We're here in Morocco, and we had to have the head of the utilities of Morocco, Mr. Hafidi, who can tell you how challenging it must be for a head of utility to have all its peak plants disconnected from one day to another. We're talking about 20% of capacity, but on an operational basis, that was the most critical. And we were quite surprised that an energy exporting country such as Algeria with natural gas pipelines could afford to simply switch from one day to another, like what Russia has not even done that. It's the Europeans that have imposed an embargo on Russia. Here, we're actually we're collateral victims, and we can see that how the European Union could accept that the country simply would shut one of the supply route to one country member, two country members, because you obviously have Portugal with you. And this essentially goes unnoticed and say, okay, you're so powerful because you have your gas, we're ready to accommodate any changes. I know you're not government official, but can you shed some light on, you know, what can countries and what can the EU do in a similar case?
Well, it's a good question, and I wanted to comment on what has been said, because as you know, Spain has 8 refinery plants. So we can introduce our natural gas via the pipe coming from Algeria, the pipe coming from Algeria through Morocco, that is the one that is close, but also we have 8 regasification plants. And in a situation as urgent and like the situation we have now in the European Union, we are still discussing how to get this gas from Spain to Germany, because we are discussing how to build a pipe through France to bring this gas from Spain to Germany. So the problem in the European Union is, as it was said, that we don't have a clear energy strategy altogether. Every country is trying to look for their own solution. We are not using all the infrastructures that we have in the European Union to cover, to supply with the best solution for everybody. And there is another point. In the European Union, we are trying to change the mix to build renewables, but we have also another goal, is to reduce the energy intensity. And in that terms, the companies has to work together with the European Union to implement the technologies that they are already in the market, and they are going to provide quite a good amount of energy, that is the energy that we don't have to use. And the competitiveness of our industries are going to increase if we are able to achieve also this goal that we always forget, you know.
Definitely. You showed some light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm going to now address the next elephant in the room, the person next to you, Monsieur Favnek. On a été vraiment surpris au Maroc par finalement l'attitude de l'Union européenne qui n'a pas été capable finalement de faire pression sur un fournisseur de gaz naturel pour dire attention, dès que vous touchez à la sécurité énergétique d'un État membre, tous les États membres sont concernés. Et on voit aussi les difficultés qu'a l'Espagne de faire passer par exemple du gaz naturel et mettre en levier toutes ces infrastructures. Je rappelle que l'Espagne a plus de stations de régasification que le reste de l'Europe réunies. Et donc on voit vraiment un développement en ordre dispersé d'une menace qui concerne tout le monde. Et donc c'est assez nouveau. Est-ce que c'est un nouveau chantage finalement qu'ont les pays producteurs de gaz, en particulier puisqu'ils sont liés par des infrastructures liées? Donc là, on marche sur la tête. On se dit, puisque c'est une commodité qui est transférée par des infrastructures fixes, comment on peut imaginer même un pays qui va se couper une jambe pour essayer d'obtenir des gains politiques? Donc globalement, comment se passe finalement cette géopolitique où on a finalement des pays producteurs qui sont prêts à jouer banco et à se dire très bien, moi je coupe le gaz sur une infrastructure que j'ai uniquement pour faire de la pression, puisque justement les pays concernés ne se plaignent même pas, ils partent en ordre dispersé et ils commencent à développer des scénarios alternatifs et ils viennent chez nous en mendiant presque des concessions au niveau d'approvisionnement énergétique.
Merci beaucoup et j'étais très honoré d'être traité d'éléphant comparé par exemple à notre ami chinois, mais c'est tout à fait intéressant. Oui, votre question est assez large, en fait elle est même très large. L'Europe, effectivement, d'abord la première considération sur l'Europe, c'est qu'elle est extrêmement dépendante des importations. L'Europe importe l'essentiel de son gaz et de son pétrole, donc ça pose effectivement des problèmes. Maintenant, sur la façon dont vous avez posé les choses, c'est-à-dire, effectivement, on va prendre le cas de la Russie. La Russie, il faut le voir, il y a 2 ans, c'était 40% du gaz consommé en Europe. La Russie fournissait 40%. Actuellement, maintenant, c'est tombé à 0. Et notre ami Joseph a très bien expliqué qu'en fait, actuellement, ce qui se passe, c'est assez intéressant. C'est qu'on n'arrive pas d'ailleurs à vraiment suivre ça au jour le jour. C'est que pour l'instant, la situation n'est pas finalement mauvaise à l'instant T où je vous parle, puisque apparemment, on a l'impression qu'on va passer l'hiver grâce au climat, grâce au changement climatique. Je ne devrais pas dire ça, je vais me faire huer, mais grâce aussi au fait que beaucoup de choses se sont mises en place. Par contre, ce qui risque d'être difficile, c'est l'année 2023. Alors maintenant, la position de la Russie est effectivement assez particulière. Normalement, un fournisseur d'énergie fait en sorte de ne pas se couper une jambe, comme vous l'avez dit. Il essaie de conserver ses clients. Je reprendrai l'exemple que vous avez cité un peu de manière différente. Je prends juste très rapidement. Le seul exemple un peu qu'on peut voir de cette chose-là, c'est en 1973, au moment de la guerre du Kippour, où quand les pays arabes ont menacé d'embargo. Et là, ils sont vraiment tirés une balle dans le pied parce que cet embargo n'a jamais été effectif. Et du coup, ça a fait que la production des pays arabes a largement diminué. Je reviens sur la situation actuelle. Donc, effectivement, pour la Russie, c'est assez particulier. particulier. Sans que la Russie, on a parlé de la Chine. La Russie, effectivement, dès 2014, avait commencé à comprendre que la situation en Ukraine devenait assez difficile pour eux. Donc la Russie a passé à ce moment-là un énorme contrat avec la Chine, un énorme contrat qui a d'ailleurs été largement avancé. Mais si on compare les chiffres, le gaz envoyé en Chine, c'est 40 milliards, ça sera de l'ordre de 30 à 40 milliards, ça va augmenter bien sûr. C'était, je répète, 200 milliards en Europe. Donc on a l'impression effectivement que les Russes ont fait une espèce de croix sur leurs énormes réserves de certains gisements. Et ça sera difficile de toute façon, que je le dis toujours. On ne va pas prendre les tuyaux qui venaient de Yamal et qui allaient en Europe et les tirer pour les mettre vers la Chine. Donc il y aura là, en plus, il n'est pas évident que la Chine ait vraiment besoin de tout le gaz de la Russie, certainement beaucoup, pour reprendre ce qu'a dit Monsieur Lang. Donc on est dans une situation effectivement un peu particulière. La position de l'Algérie, on est ici dans une situation effectivement, vous avez bien mentionné la rupture du gaz du fameux gazoduc qui alimentait, et ce qui vous pose un problème. Alors heureusement, je crois l'impression qu'à travers l'Espagne, donc vous allez récupérer bientôt un peu de gaz qui permettra de faire fonctionner, en étant extrêmement prudent sur l'origine de ce gaz, bien sûr, je n'insiste pas là-dessus. On voit actuellement effectivement que les producteurs d'énergie sont en situation relativement favorable. On a parlé déjà, Joseph a également rappelé la décision récente de l'OPEP de réduire sa production. Maintenant, on se rend compte que, en fait, je regarde toujours les chiffres, le prix du pétrole n'a pas vraiment beaucoup augmenté depuis. On n'a pas l'impression, on pense que le marché va se maintenir. Donc si on fait un bilan de tout ça, j'ai l'impression qu'en fait, il n'y a pas tellement de gros changements pour l'instant. Bien sûr, il va falloir s'adapter, il va falloir développer les renouvelables, il va falloir réduire les consommations de pétrole. Et pour l'instant, la géopolitique ne change pas énormément. Les enjeux ont bien été rappelés. Monsieur Leung rappelait le fait que la Chine, qui a besoin de beaucoup de pétrole, là, je regardais la consommation de pétrole en Chine, elle continue à augmenter. Donc les importations de pétrole de la Chine continuent à augmenter. Et ça passe par des choke points, comme on dit, qui sont un peu... Donc il y a effectivement des inquiétudes un peu partout, mais je crois que tout le monde se tient, si vous me permettez cette expression un peu familière, un peu par la barbichette. Bon, même si effectivement la situation européenne est compliquée, mais là il y a une guerre en Ukraine et donc ça entraîne des conséquences qui là sont au-delà de ce que l'on peut voir d'habitude.
Alors, juste pour rebondir là-dessus, en fait, la France est un cas particulier parce que avec son nucléaire, on a vu que les centrales, il y en a pas mal qui sont à l'arrêt, et donc on est en train de voir je m'excuse, un genre un jeu de cours que la présidence française fait en disant, écoutez, la solution finalement c'est l'Algérie. Et on fait fi finalement d'une sécurité énergétique collective. Si l'Espagne peut nous dépanner en gaz regazéfié, on va pas besoin de mettre les infrastructures, on fait tout passer par l'Italie. Donc quelque part, on se demande quelle est la partie du discours politique, je vais dire relativement démagogique, pour trouver une solution immédiate, parce que ça prend du temps, et quelle est la part, finalement, d'une stratégie concertée européenne pour essayer de diversifier les approvisionnements en gaz européen. Et si vous pouvez, j'aimerais avoir votre avis, par exemple, sur un projet, c'est le gazoduc Nigeria-Maroc, qui pourrait à ce moment-là apporter une sécurité énergétique à je ne sais pas combien de pays d'Afrique de l'Ouest qui n'ont même pas accès à l'électricité en ce moment même.
Oui, merci. Là, il y a encore beaucoup de questions. Alors, on va les prendre, il y en a deux. Je prendrai le gazoduc ensuite parce que c'est un sujet qui m'intéresse énormément. Le premier problème, donc, c'est la solidarité européenne vis-à-vis des approvisionnements. C'est clair, vous avez bien mis le doigt sur un point, c'est que sur le gaz algérien, tout le monde, alors les Italiens se sont précipités les premiers parce qu'ils ont traditionnellement de bonnes relations avec l'Algérie, la Libye d'ailleurs, et que le gazoduc, il y a un autre gazoduc, c'était le premier d'ailleurs qui a été construit vers l'Italie, fonctionne toujours. Et donc les Italiens, je crois, sont engagés. Alors les Français, évidemment, comme d'habitude, ont fait la chose suivante. Monsieur Macron est allé à Alger, ensuite Madame Borne est allée à Alger, c'est la première ministre, et à chaque fois ils ont dit non, on ne vient pas discuter du gaz, on vient discuter de coopération. Bon, quand on se déplace avec 15 ministres à Alger et qu'on a des problèmes qu'en approvisionnement, on pense que le gaz n'a pas été totalement absent. Même si je ne suis pas certain, avec tout le respect que j'ai pour mes amis algériens, qu'ils puissent exporter beaucoup plus de gaz. En tout cas, la situation est là et c'est un bon exemple également. Je veux faire de peine à personne. Aussi, on voit le chancelier allemand qui est un peu partout à travers le monde en train de négocier des contrats d'approvisionnement supplémentaires sur le... Je ne sais plus où il était encore, m'a vraiment assez frappé hier ou avant-hier. Je termine, je reviens sur le gazoduc donc, qui fait l'objet de gazoduc, donc qui partirait du Nigeria et qui remonterait le long de la côte pour arriver au moins au Maroc et peut-être un peu plus loin. Honnêtement, je ne vais pas être critique, mais il y a aussi un autre éléphant, c'est le cas de le dire, qui est le gazoduc transsaharien qui partirait du Nigeria pour aller vers l'Algérie. Quand j'en parle avec certains amis algériens, bon, ils sourient. Et quand je dis ils sourient, c'est... Bon, maintenant, il y a des études qui ont été relancées. Alors, ce gazoduc qui viendrait du Nigeria, qui arriverait au Maroc, il y a déjà un embryon de ce gazoduc. C'est le gazoduc, le West African Gas Pipeline, qui part du Nigeria et qui, au départ, alimentait la centrale électrique de Takoradi. Le gros problème, c'est que ce gazoduc n'est jamais rempli. Pourquoi? Parce que les Nigériens trouvent préférable de vendre leur gaz à l'unité de liquéfaction de Boni, qui, elle, alimente l'Europe, d'ailleurs. Et aussi, la raison, c'est que, comme souvent ça arrive, malheureusement, dans le secteur électricité en Afrique, la centrale de Takoradi ne payait pas forcément son gaz. Donc, voilà la difficulté. Mais ce gazoduc est un très beau gazoduc. Et l'idée, effectivement, d'avoir un gazoduc qui remonte, surtout avec les découvertes de gaz qu'il y a eu au Ghana, les découvertes qu'il y a au Sénégal, etc. Et puis, ça pourrait marcher dans tous les sens, alimenter le truc. Maintenant, le temps que ça se fasse, ça va prendre du temps. Et d'autre part, si l'objectif final, c'est d'aller alimenter l'Europe, ça risque d'arriver un peu tard, parce que l'Europe va faire en sorte, et je ne suis pas d'ailleurs un fanatique de ça, va faire en sorte de réduire sa consommation de gaz. Et donc, le gazoduc, investir dans un projet qui n'aura pas forcément une énorme rentabilité, ça risque d'être compliqué. Mais je souhaite que cela se fasse, bien sûr.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai eu hier des panélistes du Ghana et du Nigeria et j'ai été un petit peu éclairé aussi par la stratégie du Nigeria. C'est-à-dire qu'avec ce gazoduc, il y a un leadership régional qui commence à se mettre en place, qui est très intéressant. Et comme la décision de le financer ou pas a été avancée de 2027 à 2023, donc c'est dans quelques mois, je dirais, il est clair que pour le Nigeria, ils ont tout à fait intérêt à avoir deux fers au feu avec le gazoduc transsaharien, ne serait-ce que pour voir quels avantages ils pourraient tirer de cette alternative qui est beaucoup plus inclusive et beaucoup plus promettrice au niveau régional et qui résoudrait aussi énormément de problèmes au niveau du développement économique de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui représente un autre enjeu sécuritaire pour l'Europe et pour le Maroc également, pays de transit, à savoir la migration. I'd like to switch to you, Dr. Utsen. Basically, you're you're an analyst on futures prospects and the World Energy Council. What do you think about the attitude of energy-producing countries that are ready to just, cut one leg, just even if they're tied to infrastructure, to try and wield pressure and see what will be the response of the customers, and also, to some extent, to see also the impact, because what happened is that when Europe decreed the self-imposed embargo on Russian gas, we've seen the prices rise tremendously. And I disagree a little bit with the analysis of Mr. Favnek on the oil crisis of 1973. It enabled the oil prices to be tripled, and we saw how much wealth it has provided to these countries, and we saw how the next Iran-Iraq war provided even additional wealth because the prices go up. So what's your take on this dynamic of trying actually to raise the price regardless of the cost, to try it and put pressure on the global energy supply?
Well, thank you, Chair. I think a starting point might be to quote our colleague from Germany who said that Germany has made a series of blunders, and perhaps the energy ecosystem itself has made a series of blunders. As the World Energy Council, we like to think about the energy trilemma of sustainability, access, and of course security. And it is the case that over the last decade, the focus in Europe in particular has been on sustainability, perhaps at the expense of security. And so there was a blunder made by the European community in general around focusing on sustainability, perhaps at the expense of security. Now, we are correcting that and we're shifting, but we have lost sight, I think, perhaps of the issue of energy affordability and access. What's not been in this conversation is that a third of the global population, 1 billion people, live in energy poverty. And so if we imagine that energy security is about oil and gas, we might find in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, that mass migration, continued human insecurity continue to plague Europe in particular from Africa. And so as we talk about resolving energy security in the short term, we have to talk about resolving energy security in the medium and long term, and that becomes a conversation about human security. And so what I'd like to do is to connect the debate in Europe about energy security to the debate in the global south about human development. And if we look at the origins, the sources of rare earth metals, the key components, the upstream inputs for the energy transition, That is a story that is about Africa, it's about Latin America, and we have to bring those voices into the conversation. And so, from the World Energy Council's perspective, we think the way to look at this is what we call the first decade realities. Yes, there are certain realities in the next decade, ensuring winter, ensuring energy supply during the next decade. But then there's the second decade choices that we have to make, particularly developed countries will have to make around where they put their supply chains. Do they use the need for supply chain redistribution to drive investments and advances in underdeveloped countries? And that brings us to the third decade imperatives. If we think back about the political implications of the Arab Spring and the migratory issues coming out of the Arab Spring, if we fail to address the human security elements in the next 2 decades, in the third decade we'll face climate-related insecurities that will make everything else we've dealt with look like a picnic. And so the danger is that the energy ecosystem, energy leadership in the next decade makes the tremendous blunder of thinking that they're dealing with short-term energy security when actually we're dealing with long-term humanizing energy, what the World Energy Council calls humanizing energy, which is something that we cannot do on the basis of energy nationalism. We have to do it at a global level, and we have to do it together. And let me finish by saying that is going to require energy transitions that are transparent, that are trustworthy, and that bring the stakeholders around the table. And to come to your question, there are individuals and countries at the moment that are weaponizing energy. We think that that is a major strategic mistake, both at a national level and at a global level, that instead of weaponizing energy, we need to mobilize energy for human security.
Thank you very much. And actually both are related because obviously if you weaponize it, then you raise the issue on energy security and a fast transition. So before I yield the floor to Dr. Kamal to talk about, what should we expect on energy security, energy access, and energy transition, I've got Dr. Kramer that for a short reply, I suppose, on something that was evoked during the last previous conversation.
Yes, and it is a very important misunderstanding because Marius Oosthuizen has just said that there is a trade-off between sustainability, security, and access and affordability of energy, and the opposite is true. We know that renewable energy has zero marginal cost, and it's now the cheapest forms of energy. Even new build renewable energies are cheaper than existing nuclear plants and existing coal plants in many cases. So it is actually the energy form that helps us drive affordability and access much more easily than the traditional systems. The second one is on security. Even the head of our pro-business Liberal Party now calls renewables freedom energies because they have understood that you can de-risk your whole energy system, your national security, by focusing on the harvesting of your own environmental flows to harvest the energy from there than being dependent on imported technologies and materials in the fossil energy industry and in the nuclear energy industry. It is important to understand that the old view of a trilemma between these different objectives is simply wrong. Once you start integrating modern renewable energies into the energy technology choices, then you have a synergy instead of a trilemma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think you're actually pointing the finger at the core issue. Essentially, the world energy order is too much influenced by the incumbent main fossil fuel energies. And it begs the question whether Germany's role in the current crisis could be the same as in the early 1990s to kick off renewables at a decent level. And now we look forward to see what will be the next level and the contribution of Germany in this crisis. I also know that the main problem of an energy transition is that because of the influence of the incumbents, we obviously have players that have vested infrastructure, vested interest, and they're not really eager to transition and give away their assets to that extent. So that's a tremendous problem because whatever happens in the West influences the strategy for the rest of the world, and we can no longer afford to be dragged down by issues of the past. With that, and I'm sorry, I'll go back to you later, I'd like to have Dr. Kamal's take on what should we expect at COP27. We have, obviously, President Biden has announced that he will be there. I don't know whether it's for electoral purposes or whether you think any breakthrough could be expected at this conference, and we obviously have other issues, but can you let us know what are the most urgent points to be addressed at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh next week?
Thank you very much for inviting me within this selective gathering. Let me tell you that I do expect that the agenda will be drastically changed from its proposed one last year. It should have been focusing on a follow-up of the progress achieved for the energy transition. Unfortunately, the Russian-Ukrainian confrontation has actually impacted the agenda because most of the world countries have changed their situation immediately upon the crisis to move back again to the nuclear energy sourcing and the coal, as well as more relying on other alternative of the fossil energy. Unlikely, the forum, the COP27 will take place within few days in Egypt, and I do expect that it will be a lot of debates, not only energy debates, but political debates as well will take place, taking into consideration the impact that both the West and the East have put on the Middle East. We have been drastically impacted by this confrontation taking place every now and then between the East and the West. We have suffered a lot during the COVID era, the 2 years, due to the confrontation between the East and the West. And we're now suffering again, most of us, despite of being oil producers, but we are relying on importing. We are net importer of most of our daily and life requirements. Each barrel of petrol that we are exporting at whatever the cost is, starting from $20 to $150, we are importing 1,200 bucks of goods from the West. So by raising the prices of oil due to whatever the reason is, we are being impacted. And we've seen the last situation when the food industry have actually raised drastically due to the increase of gas prices. As we all know, each ton of ammonia consumes something like 40 million BTU of gas. When the gas was $4 to $8 per million BTU, the ton of ammonia cost something like $160 only for ammonia gas. Then for other processes, something like $80 more. So the ton of ammonia cost was 200 to 240 US dollar. Now, on increasing the prices to something like $40 per million BTU in Europe, in average. Some other countries reaches 70 plus. So the ton of ammonia exceeds $1,800 US dollar. Ammonia is a main feedstock to the fertilizer, which has impacted the food industry in general, the food supply chain in general. So I expect the current war, the world war, will be a food war. Will not be an energy war or water war. It will be a food war, because all the supply chain for food is now increasing drastically, and this is actually impacting and harming all the developing and poor countries. So I do expect a lot of confrontation and debates during the COP27.
Thank you very much. We'll go back on the issues of COP27, but this paves the way to, first of all, what you said about ammonia is music to the ears of Morocco, major player in the fertilizer industry. We import about currently 2 million tons of ammonia, and you can imagine how that impacts also the price of fertilizer globally. And it also puts Morocco on the global map for food security, and I'm happy to introduce the two speakers ahead, a view from Argentina that is relying obviously on Moroccan fertilizer and fertilizer amongst others. Major player in food security. You produce a lot of soya beans that you export throughout the world. And our next speaker, Alexander Kateb, who's going to talk about food security in the Maghreb, and in the Arab world, Middle East, and how that dynamic of energy, food starts to kick in. Obviously, we take the example of Lebanon, where we see the stockpile of wheat having blown up accidentally, obviously. But it shows the example of what we might expect in the near future. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Before I get into this food security issue, I think it relates a lot to energy as well. I'd like to make a comment. I'm very glad the colleague here brought the voice of the global south. I thought I was the only one in the room. I think that's actually the true elephant in the room. It's and he mentioned quite right. I could repeat his words one by one, which I'm not going to, obviously. But he mentioned something that I would like to stress, and it's transitions. We have to think about energy transitions. Not all of us can transition and will transition in the same way. And this has been a very focused discussion on developed countries and not at all on developing countries. Developing countries have, and going back also to the trilemma you mentioned, you're right, renewables are more efficient, are cheaper, but once you get the investments for them, if you don't get the infrastructure investments, you're in big trouble. And that's a problem that developing countries are facing at the moment. And going back to something the European Union knows quite well, the unity in diversity, I think we can use the same analogy for the transitions in the developing world. The unity is we want the same sustainable world. We all want to get to the same place. We have to think strategically. We cannot build walls. We can't pretend the problem doesn't exist. If we don't all do it together, it's just not going to happen. It simply won't work. So we have to understand this diversity and understand that even though we all want to get to the same place, we have different paths to do it, and we have completely different starting points. And if we fail to understand that, that's a complete mistake, and that's another blunder that's going to happen. Also, a colleague mentioned that the European Union is moving out of gas. Well, we have to understand that gas will be a transition for many countries. So what are we going to do? And I connect with what you were saying with food and energy crisis, when our main market destinations say, well, I'm not buying this from you because it hasn't been transported in green hydrogen. And we say, well, but perhaps we have the second largest reservoir of non-conventional gas. Can we just transition to other hydrogens? Not even just saying gas, but saying other colored hydrogens. No, we want green hydrogen. So that will be a true problem. And that's what I think what we have to start thinking seriously about. There's a saying that if you walk alone, you walk faster, but if you walk together, you walk further, and we have to think that. And I'll leave this for later. We have to think on the financing of this issue. Thank you.
Definitely, you are actually opening the floor to our next two speakers after Alexandre, will be actually how to mobilize financing from both the partnerships that are needed for securing huge amounts of investments in the global south and globally actually, because obviously our players are global players, and how the industry adjusts obviously to challenges it has hopefully anticipated, because we always like to think that the industry is ahead can anticipate those changes. So Alexandre, the floor is yours. The idea is really to see, how, energy, food, economic impact on, if you can start with the region and obviously globally, what do you see coming?
Thank you, Khalid, but with all due respect, I will start the other way around. Because I think if you don't understand what's happening at the global level, you cannot understand the consequences for any region in the world, including the MENA region. So I've been listening a lot to what has been said, very interesting points of view and argumentation. For me, there is one elephant in the room, actually, that we have not addressed, which is the sanctions. Because, actually, we have been talking a lot about energy dependency and so on, and failed market mechanism. But actually, the the most salient, new development that we have been seeing since the start of the war in Ukraine is the package of sanctions that have progressively wrecked the ability of some large players, let's name them Russia, to provide the markets with energy and with food products. So basically we are seeing a lot of disruptions now that are really a consequence of these sanctions. And actually, if you look at the ways these risks are mitigated, there has been the Black Sea Grain Initiative, in which actually Russia agreed to participate. And I think this was a very positive development. It shows that some problems can be decoupled overall between the geopolitical conflict over which everyone can have its own opinion, and such pressing issues as food security for the planet, and especially for the most vulnerable countries. Which brings me to this idea that we have moved from a market economy, so to say, more or less, at the global level, or a market-based economy, into an economy that is actually managed through quantities, like in the old times, like in the Soviet Union, when actually every product has its own quantity that was assigned to it, and not through prices. And we are seeing no shortages, because this economy that is based on non-market mechanisms leads to shortages. And this is something that is really obvious. Any economist in the world knows that since the early 20th century and even before that. So this brings me to the issue of the MENA region and the crisis in the MENA region, the food crisis and the energy crisis. Both are connected, and I've been listening with great interest to Dr. Oosthuizen's trilemma, because I think he's right. At least in the short term, there is this trilemma between these three dimensions: the sustainability, affordability, and security. And we can transpose that easily from energy to food, actually. And this is what we see. And the MENA region is a point in case, because its food dependency is about 50% actually now, and it has been growing actually since the 1950s or 1960s, since we have the first statistics. And this is related to three factors, as has been said: energy, the cost of energy, which is an input into the prices of food, and which has been growing and which has been managed in a very disorderly way. The second one is obviously climate change, and this has tremendous consequences for the region, and this has been sometimes aggravated by some policies, including some agricultural policies. We are here in Morocco, so let's talk bluntly about some mistakes that have been made about the model of exporting commodities that are consumed in European markets, like fruits and other vegetables that require a lot of water, actually, and that lead to very severe hydric stress, and that kill, actually, a lot of Moroccan agricultures and farmers in the cereals and other critically important staples for the local population. So there should be a reconsideration of these mistakes and of this policy. The other mistake or failure is the coordination at the regional level. We see that obviously between Morocco and Algeria, but we can see these failures all across the board in all the region. The last prominent case was between Qatar and Saudi Arabia at the time of the blocus. So this led to a burgeoning Qatari food industry, but overall the problems have not been solved, and this remains, this pressing food security concerns has not been addressed.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. You've addressed actually another elephant in the room. I think we're going to end up with a whole flock of elephants today, because they're all coming up gradually. And it's the issue of water. I mean, if Morocco has chosen a strategy aimed at exporting more expensive high cash crops to Europe, it's precisely because it has a limited amount of water that if it would use to produce wheat, it would not be able to feed its own population. Now, the idea was to bet on gaining a lot of revenues from exporting high cash crops, to be able to then to import cheaper wheat from other regions of the world where water is not so much an issue. So on a global balance, Morocco's agricultural industry is balanced in terms of export and import when you look at the monetary terms. So that was the strategy behind it. But it's also important to note that water scarcity with the climate change, we see the climate we have now in November, it's absurd. And we know that water will be also a huge issue, not only for food security, but also for access to water. And we know that solutions exist. They all rely, hopefully, on something more sustainable, which is renewable energies. And this will be our next topic, because those solutions, and I'll have the industry speak after the investor and the companies that have been involved in framing a little bit the investments needed in the renewable energy sector, in the water energy sector. And I yield the floor to Patrice, if he could shed the light on actually what is needed for securing massive investments in the energy transition. And if I may say, we have another issue that if you invest massively in renewable energies, and if you supply also the way gas infrastructure supply cheap electricity or cheap hydrogen in the future, it also becomes a weapon. And you have a contradiction here. If you want international investments, just like it has been the case with Nord Stream, I suppose, you can still use it as a weapon. What's your take on that?
Si vous me le permettez, je vais d'abord faire deux petits mots en français pour remercier l'Institut Amadeus et en particulier Brahim Fassifiri pour nous réunir à cette 14e édition. Je trouve que c'est une excellente initiative. Ça faisait presque 3 ans que ce n'était pas arrivé, donc un grand merci à Brahim et à l'Institut. Et très heureux de vous retrouver tous. So let's switch to English and try to address your question here. First of all, I'd like to pick up what Joseph has been saying from IEF, my neighbor here at the beginning of the session, which is extremely interesting. We are not talking about a new global order or new energy order because of Ukraine. It started a long time before. And let's try to understand that Ukraine has been, in fact, some kind of accelerator, a catalyst in some respect. And we have been forced, and we are forced now, to change our viewpoint on many aspects in terms of governance, regulations, supply chain, but also technology. And this is, to me, extremely stimulating. I know it's tough time, but I believe that this is very good, interesting, and innovative time for not only a government, but also operators to try to find new solutions. Ideology may be a little bit fading away towards pragmatism, towards reality. We're coming back again now on much more acceptable solutions based on nuclear. Nuclear has been for years some kind of a land of war between people. Now, well, this is a transition where we are. We have to take all the means at our disposal to try to make this transition to much more renewable and acceptable situation. And this transition include waste to energy, hydrogen, nuclear, and many other aspects that the technology is driving. I'm also speaking about, I would say, under the authority of NG and Acciona. They know very well that technology is driving very much the change when it is stimulated by the necessity to do something. So first, okay, it's risk, it's a tough time, but this is a real large ground of opportunities. The second is, I would say, I heard also, there is some kind of a lack of financing. I'm hearing this many times. It's not true. There is no lack of financing. Go and see IDB, Islamic Bank in Jeddah. Go to see the World Bank. Go to see the AFD in France, the GBIC in Japan, and they have money. They have programs. Today, as an example, for example, there is a Japan Green Transformation Program which has been developed, set up, and which is accelerating today its objective because of what started in Feb of this year, but also in Korea. In Korea, where I would say the leaders of Korea has been deciding to speed up their nuclear program. So there is a reaction. The big risks that I see here is that, I would say, as a matter of fact, people are thinking about their own population, their own boundaries. So there is a risk, and there is a fragmented risk today of, I would say, taking the best you can for your population, for your basic needs that you have to address firsthand. Because at the end of the day, when you're a politician, I'm not, but when you're a politician, you're elected by your people. Winter is coming in, and there will be others every year. We have to cope with this transition. So just to make a rapid conclusion on that, I've been director of AFD. I can tell you, money is waiting for a good project. What is the difficulty is to find so-called bankable projects which are technically sound and which can envisage the long run. And to make a conclusion word on that, you asked me about the PPP. I think the PPP's structures will have to adapt themselves. The risk matrix, which is the basis of the agreements between local bodies and public bodies, will have to be reviewed totally. In particular, who is fixing the tariff grid? When are you going during the path of the contract, which is 25, 26, 30 years, depending on the investment of the private body? Who and when are you going to be authorized to raise your tariff according to your economics? At the end of the day, when a PPP fails, it's because the risk matrix has been totally flawed at the beginning. That's my
Thank you very much, Fabrice. You actually mentioned another problem. I'm not going to call him an elephant this time, but basically around nuclear and finding solutions, we have an obvious problem. Is even if you want to decide to build a nuclear power plant now, it won't be operational for in the next 10 to 15 years. So how do you bridge the gap?
Because you think about the former nuclear solution based on French technology, Russian technology, Korean technology. If you're traveling in Africa, like I'm doing a lot, you see that there are some technical solutions on micro-reactor, for example, and they are fitted to work. And I can tell you, today, some African countries, I can name them, but 2 of them at least, have been choosing to try by the end of 2 years, to have operated on their soil, on their ground, micro nuclear solutions. And it's going to change the energy landscape.
Very much so, Fabrice, but keep in mind that those technologies are not yet operational. That means it will take time. I'd like to just take a little example of South Africa with its pebble reactor, smaller reactor that was more accessible, and we've seen the future of that happening. We also see during this war something that nobody even thought of, the weaponizing of a nuclear power plant. And if you go to an unstable region, you know that this could be a topic that you could gain a lot of leverage from, and blackmail not only a region but the world.
Water at the same time is exactly the same. Water dams are today targets for the militaries, and they have a huge, I can tell you, impact on populations also.
So we're going to have this back and forth dialogue, because I can tell you that if you are damaging a nuclear power plant, you're also undermining nuclear solutions. If you attack a power dam, you're not essentially saying we should stop building dams because they're too dangerous. So that also has implications on how fast we want to diversify from fossil fuels and try to bridge a gap, immediate need of a gap, an immediate need that was actually mentioned, and at least on the marketing base, by ENGIE. ENGIE has said, you know, we're an energy transition company. We want to move fast. We want to deploy the solutions. And it's been obviously the marketing motto for some time. I'm sorry to bring it up, boil it down to marketing. This is how we see it. We're like, how can a big gas operator, a distributor, and owner of some previous nuclear power plants, I don't know what's the case in Belgium, but how do you do that? And last but not least, if you can, we have an hour still of a discussion where we're going to be able to interact one another. And Yeah, you also teach at the Moroccan SX school, and I'd like to know, based on all what's happening, what kind of advice would you give to the new students?
Merci. Alors, je vais continuer sur la diversité linguistique chère au Maroc, et je vais donc intervenir en français, mais je pourrais répondre aux questions en anglais si vous le souhaitez également. J'ai effectivement deux casquettes. La casquette NG. NG, c'est leader de la transition énergétique, leader mondial, 102 000 personnes à travers une cinquantaine de pays dans le monde, avec un objectif majeur, le net zéro carbone d'ici 2045 pour NG et pour ses clients. J'ai une autre casquette, effectivement. Je suis professeur d'énergie et de développement durable sur le campus de l'ESSEC Business School, sur le campus Afrique, qui est effectivement situé au Maroc. L'ESSEC Business School vient d'être élue la business school mondiale la plus avancée sur les questions environnementales et énergétiques, pas plus tard qu'hier. Alors effectivement, qu'est-ce que je dis à mes élèves? J'essaie d'être le plus simple possible, parce que c'est des businessmen, donc ils ne sont pas ingénieurs, ils ne comprennent pas forcément tout, ils sont pas à Sciences Po non plus. J'essaie de leur dire qu'effectivement l'équilibre mondial il est de plus en plus fragile. On parle de New Global Order, New Energy Order. Là, en réalité, on parle plutôt de disorder, de fragmentation généralisée, d'une solidarité finalement très très faible entre les pays. Et puis là, on se rend compte qu'on gère l'urgence. Et on l'a vu autour de la table, mis à part peut-être l'intervention de Marcus, qui était davantage tournée vers l'avenir. Et ensuite, on a enfin parlé d'avenir. Donc, effectivement, je leur explique l'interdépendance des crises, l'interdépendance des intérêts, des enjeux, et que finalement, tout est lié. La crise énergétique, la crise climatique, et on est réellement au pied du mur, c'est une réalité. La crise écologique, le combat contre la pauvreté, contre les inégalités, contre la faim dans le monde, la question des matières premières, la question de la croissance, et même plutôt de la décroissance, du fantasme de la croissance éternelle. Et donc le besoin d'avoir finalement une approche très systémique. Et c'est effectivement ce qu'on essaye de faire chez Engie, et c'est ce qu'on essaye de faire avec les industriels du secteur, c'est finalement de trouver des solutions qui permettent à chacun, en s'adaptant aux contextes locaux, de passer le plus rapidement du gris très foncé au vert très clair. Et ça ne se fera pas en 2 secondes, d'un coup de baguette magique, on est d'accord. Mais malgré tout, on est tous d'accord qu'il faut accélérer, et accélérer très fort. Et donc ça passe évidemment par de la production d'énergie renouvelable et ou bas carbone. Alors on peut parler du nucléaire, on est un acteur du nucléaire, notamment en Belgique. On sait que c'est une énergie qui produit peu de CO2, qui est baseload, qui nécessite beaucoup moins de matières premières que les autres énergies, environ 6 à 10 fois moins de matières premières que les énergies renouvelables, une empreinte au sol qui est plutôt réduite, une énergie qui est plutôt cheap, qui est plutôt peu chère. Mais dans un monde profondément instable, climatiquement instable, géopolitiquement instable, c'est compliqué. Ça peut être une arme, on l'a vu en Ukraine, quelle que soit la taille des centrales, quelle que soit la technologie utilisée. Ça peut être très cher, avec des coûts additionnels qu'on n'avait pas prévus. Alors évidemment, on peut parler d'Hinkley Point, on peut parler de l'EPR de Flamanville. C'est certes des technologies peut-être du passé, mais il faut quand même le mentionner. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait aussi des déchets radioactifs, hautement radioactifs, les 3% hautement radioactifs? Not in my backyard, surtout pas dans mon jardin. Et puis, sans parler des questions de maintenance et de l'impact climatique aussi sur ces centrales, les tremblements de terre, la sécheresse et tous ces impacts, les inondations par exemple, qui peuvent avoir un impact très fort, quelle que soit la taille de la centrale. Et puis un autre point, la question des compétences, et c'est extrêmement important sur la filière nucléaire. Pour monter une filière nucléaire, il faut des dizaines et des dizaines d'années. Et nous, industriels du secteur, on est un peu dépendants des signaux envoyés par nos pays respectifs, que ce soit la France, la Belgique ou d'autres pays, qui nous disent finalement on arrête le nucléaire. Donc nous, évidemment, on travaille sur d'autres compétences et c'est pas un bouton on-off, donc c'est beaucoup plus difficile à démarrer que ça. Et pour moi, c'est le point clé, la question des compétences au-delà de la question de la sécurité.
Oui, je m'excuse d'avoir interrompu. Je croyais que tu avais terminé, c'est pour ça. En fait, c'est juste par rapport au nucléaire, et on va rebondir là-dessus par la suite. Il y a aussi l'effet d'échelle et les coûts, en fait. Quand on a un grand réseau, on peut mettre plusieurs centrales et amortir les investissements dans la formation et dans la gestion de ces centrales. Ce n'est pas le cas des pays du Sud global, la plupart, hein, à part de très gros pays. Donc ça aussi, ça pose problème. Est-ce qu'il y a un point que tu voulais continuer?
Non, peut-être en une minute. Effectivement, il y a l'effet d'échelle, et dans le nucléaire, c'est très important. Même avec des petites unités, il est très compliqué économiquement de rendre ça viable. Et donc, au-delà de la production d'énergie décarbonée, il y a évidemment les technologies de transmission avancées, les technologies de stockage, les interconnexions énergétiques, hein, de travailler sur une efficience du système avec des smart grids plus ou moins régionaux, et puis évidemment les vecteurs énergétiques, l'hydrogène vert, l'ammoniac vert, et ça a pour nous un avenir, et si ça se trouve beaucoup plus rapide que prévu.
Oui, sans oublier le fait que pour produire de l'ammoniac vert, il faut énormément d'énergie renouvelable. Et ces énergies renouvelables sont pour l'instant mobilisées pour essayer de produire de l'électricité renouvelable autant que possible. Et bien entendu, il y aura un problème d'espace. And that leads me to switch. Oui.
Oui, juste un point. Alors, vous avez aussi l'hydrogène naturel. Au Maroc, vous avez un potentiel énorme d'hydrogène naturel, présent dans le sous-sol. Au Mali également, au Brésil, en Afrique du Sud, il y a beaucoup de pays qui peuvent aussi éviter la technologie de l'électrolyse à des coûts extrêmement bas. On n'est pas du tout dans les coûts de l'oil and gas, on est sur une technologie...
Oui, absolument. Des technologies, on va dire, d'hydrogène fossile. Enfin, d'hydrogène non renouvelable, on va dire. Hein, ça je pense qu'on peut être prudent.
Oui, ça reste de l'hydrogène renouvelable qu'on extrait du sous-sol.
Oui, ben, une fois qu'on l'a extrait, il n'existe plus. En fait, that leads me to address the issue of nuclear energy and the way the old global order has been built upon, has been secured, and basically we have an issue here. You have an energy supply solution. For example, in Morocco, we have a project. I'm going to address this question to Joseph. We have a project, it's called X-Links, and it aims at generating 3.5 gigawatts of permanent power with battery backup and extremely cheap renewables in the south of Morocco, and feed it to the UK at much lower cost than the Hinkley Point nuclear project. So I've always been following what the DOE has been doing ever since you were chief of staff, and I was fascinated by the 27 or now probably much more than the $30 billion a year budget from the US Department of Energy, and most of it was dedicated to securing and securing nuclear stockpiles and nuclear technology. The ERE part, the renewable energy part of that budget was like almost negligible. I hope it has shifted gradually, but obviously where I'm getting at is the weight and the lobby of nuclear energy and its influence in either downplaying other renewable solutions, such as the case of the UK-Morocco link, X-Links project, if I can add an X, and what is this, and proliferation issues and risk issues. I'd like to have the take from your previous job at US DOE and on the nuclear prospects globally, since you're obviously an energy forum. The floor is yours, Joseph.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening conversation. Very much enjoyed the different viewpoints. In terms of the DOE budget, when I was there, the nuclear part of it was disproportional, but I would use the word nuclear in parentheses because it was basically about cleaning up old nuclear weapons sites throughout the United States. It's the largest environmental cleanup program on the planet. And so that's where most of the budget was going. But since I left in 2005, probably the emphasis in spending on renewables and energy technology is easily half of the budget now. And I'm particularly happy that the current administration has decided to quadruple the amount of spending on clean energy R&D. Because again, in my view, that is the future. That's how we get the other half of the climate goals accomplished that we can't do with just wind and solar alone. In terms of nuclear power, I mean, I actually don't think the industry is that influential. I think it's actually not lived up to its potential and hasn't really answered the critics in a very forceful way. But I think it's quite easy. I mean, the International Energy Agency, which I used to be the vice chairman of, views nuclear power as a key solution to meeting our climate goals. My old office at DOE is now investing huge amounts of money in this whole concept of small modular nuclear reactors. But I guess I would put myself in agreement, with my colleague here. We need all forms of energy to decarbonize and to meet our climate goals. As it was said, hydrogen is a great solution. It has so much potential. But I think we have to recognize there are also many challenges. There's this whole divide between blue or green. I think we have to do away with the color codes, by the way. I think we have to look at the energy intensity part of it and the CO2 intensity of it. But just to give you one challenge for hydrogen, and we just did a report on it, we're very, very pro-hydrogen. In order for us to meet our 2050 goals for hydrogen and the net zero report that the IEA put out, which is about 25% of the total mix, the world needs to produce more energy than it produces today, just to meet, now that's a green hydrogen goal, of course, but there are great potential in places in Africa and certainly here and in Spain and Portugal, but you're looking at a monumental challenge. That's not saying we shouldn't do it. I think hydrogen actually has the most potential of all these energy sources, but we have to keep using everything at our disposal. Nuclear is actually being used now quite effectively. You can argue about the cost side of it, especially as you look at the trillions of dollars we're putting into other technologies. But I guess that's what I would say. I think we need a lot more wind and solar. Personally, if I were in the private sector now, I would be in the wind and solar and renewable sector because there's so much private money chasing wind and solar projects. But there are issues in certain markets that, because of infrastructure issues, that it actually, even though it's cheaper to produce, although that's becoming a question with critical minerals, it's free. The source of energy is free with wind and solar. But the critical minerals needed to make the panels and the steel and the copper and everything else, that costs a lot of money. And right now, because of ESG rules, we're not financing those mining projects. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to a lithium mine. I have. It's a very dirty mining process. And you can't get those projects funded now. So there's a lot of complexities, I think, to your question.
Definitely, Joseph, but you're obviously talking to someone who has been involved in renewable energy for about 35 to perhaps even more years in trying to develop, for example, Morocco's wind potential. We're talking about just on the Sahara coastline of 6,000 gigawatt onshore. It has been mentioned during the panel 2 days ago at actual production cost in the vicinity of 2.5 cents a kilowatt, and they could easily be dropped when we reach a larger scale. But and that's obviously very interesting for deploying hydrogen. I mean, 6,000 gigawatts is about half the entire installed capacity in Europe. So we can double that and produce green hydrogen and supply these markets. But let's not forget that if you talk to actually the person who introduced feed-in tariffs in Germany in the early 90s, I had a discussion with him, Hans-Josef Fell, he's a green politician, and he told me, look, this big hydrogen hype is just a disguised natural gas plan. And if you take out the colors, it looks like, the idea was to say, oh, we're going to produce green hydrogen, but because we don't want to have green hydrogen produced in Morocco and fed to Europe, we'll start with the incumbent customers, and we'll get the natural gas, and we'll label it transitional hydrogen. And luckily, and it's kind of interesting, I'd like to rebounce on the Bush era that you were active in, George W. Bush, who said we're addicted to oil. And he obviously tried to do something because he's the one who kicked the hydrogen, green hydrogen prospects way before it has reached now its hype, I would say. And I was obviously involved in all the process. And, you know, essentially when a person is addict, you end up wondering, should you talk to an addicted person or should you talk to the dealer? And it looks like the dealer of natural gas to Europe has happened to be Russia. And by what they have done, in fact, they may have transformed completely the ambition of energy transition through hydrogen, and he perhaps influenced the color of the hydrogen. And that's what leads me to give the floor to Andreas Kremer, who has been raised his tent card for a while.
Thank you. And it is to bust a few myths and to say some inconvenient truths. There has been too much defense, in my view, of natural gas on this panel, and I therefore feel it necessary to remind you that natural gas methane is 60 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Natural gas systems are incredibly leaky from the beginning to the end, and they're not therefore part of the permanent solution. That applies also for synthetic methane that we may have at some point in the future. From a climate perspective, it is not a solution. The second one is a lesson that has been learned by many countries after the first attack of Russia against Ukraine in 2014. Let's remember, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons with the Budapest Memorandum in return for guarantees by Russia, by Britain and by the United States, guarantee its territorial integrity. Nevertheless, Russia, being a guarantor of that integrity, attacked that country. The lesson that has been learned all around the world is you better not give up nuclear weapons if you have them. You better get yourself your hands on some nuclear weapons if you don't have them. And if you have the technology base, then you develop your economy in such a way that you have the breakout capacity so that you can build yourself your own nuclear weapons at short notice in case that should be necessary. And the nuclear energy program, restart program in South Korea is evidently a point in case in this one. So when we look at the situation there is unstated military intent in the rebuilding of the nuclear programs. They call them civilian, but in actual fact they have a military purpose. Small modular reactors are not new. We have them in submarines, we have them on aircraft carriers, icebreakers, in satellites, in research stations. They're not cheap, they're not clean, they produce the waste as well. They're not safe, neither in terms of operational safety nor in terms of security. They're still bombs waiting to be exploded in case an enemy comes in and wants to do that. So when we look at nuclear, we have to understand is there are only three reasons why nuclear power plants can be built. One is economic delusion, simply not getting the figures right. The second one is corruption, and there's a lot of corruption around the world. And the third one is unstated nuclear intent. In most countries it's a combination of those three, but there is absolutely no business case and no energy economy rationale for building new nuclear power plants. Thank you.
Definitely, I totally agree with you, unfortunately for Joseph maybe, but you know, nuclear power plants, civilian nuclear power plants come from nuclear submarine, you know, and Admiral Rickover and what he has done to influence, obviously, President Carter to suspend the US nuclear program, who was a submariner, who knew what he was talking about, is indicative of that concern. Regarding the issue of Ukraine, obviously, Senator Lugar and Nunn have spent, you know, billions, over 20 billions of US taxpayers' money to ensure that all the stockpiles of the former Soviet Unions will be disposed and will be handled in secure hand when all those republics become independent. And it's also interesting talking to Ukrainian, to have their Ukrainian perspective, telling me basically we had no choice at the Budapest summit. We were told by the US, you want recognition of your sovereignty, get rid of your nuclear stockpile and give it away to Russia. So with that, I yield the floor to you, Joseph.
Well, I'm not going to defend the case for nuclear. I think it's quite clear, and reasonable people disagree, obviously. But anyway, I just want to address the methane points and the part about natural gas. And I agree with you. Methane is a terrible emission that is much, much worse than for the atmosphere and global warming than even carbon emissions. But the issue with methane is it's easily addressable and mitigated. You can capture it. We have existing technologies that need to do it. Right now, there's at the last COP meeting in Glasgow, there's the big success of that meeting was the Global Methane Pledge. All these countries joined together to reduce global methane emissions. I'm told there's some big news going to be announced at this upcoming meeting on advances there. So methane, the problem of methane is not a reason not to use natural gas. And by the way, your friend who said on hydrogen that, you know, this is just a way to use blue hydrogen, well, look, that totally ignores the potential of CCUS and carbon capture, use, and storage. If we're ever going to meet that 25% hydrogen goal in net zero, we need economy-wide scale-up of CCUS. Hydrogen and CCUS are joined at the hip. I mean, there's no way to do one without the other. And I think from a technology standpoint, you know, it's often presented that hydrogen is the quick answer and it's easily doable, and CCUS is the more expensive one, more complex. It's actually the reverse. CCUS is actually a much more advanced technology than hydrogen, and both are needed to advance our climate goals.
Thank you very much. Obviously, we need a variety of technology, as you have rightly mentioned, but let me just remind you that we've been talking about CCUS for a while, and it looks like the budget that has been spent on CCUS, you know, I think we're past ITER budget and nuclear fusion. I mean, it's huge, it's tremendous, and we don't see it effectively coming out. And you have also long-term leakage. You have a lot of issues that needs to be addressed. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, just a quick, if you look at the investment in hydrogen versus CCUS, hydrogen dwarfs CCUS. I mean, there's hardly any investment going into CCUS. This is a major problem that the world has to come to grips with. There's a lot of private and government money chasing hydrogen, but hardly any in CCUS.
Okay, we obviously have, you know, it's CCUS for hydrogen. Let's not forget about that. So we have, you know, an issue that is underlying a transition to hydrogen. And let's not forget that all the pledges on hydrogen are actually theoretical. The money that's been put on the ground for hydrogen is not significant. It's just say, you know, let's have a moonshot and let's just go for hydrogen, etc. We have to see in the future how that will unfold. We forgot to talk about a critical issue about why are we even talking about hydrogen in the first place and giving it so much attention. And I'll ask Dr. Lung to address this issue. We're obviously dealing with deep decarbonization of the economy. And when you look at climate change, you realize that electricity is just responsible for some 20–25% of global carbon emission. Then you have transport, you have heating, but another elephant is industry. How do you decarbonize industry? Just for the steel production in the world, it represents 10% of global emissions. It's almost like 3 times air travel. So you can imagine how much emission are on the plate and why green hydrogen is important. And obviously, when you talk about any new technology that's being fielded, such as green hydrogen, everybody looks at China, just like they've looked at batteries, just like they looked at renewables. And we know that China is investing in electrolyzers. We know that the biggest producer of steel in the world is China, biggest, obviously, threat to the climate. What is your country's prospects on decarbonizing its industry and the technology that will be used to, and what will be the impact on the price of those technology, because we've seen what it has done to renewables globally?
Well, thanks for this opportunity to intervene on this very, very important topic. Because as I said at the beginning, China is still the world's biggest user of energy and is concerned about the security aspect, the affordability aspect, the climate aspect. Now, as far as green hydrogen is concerned, I think it's gaining a bit of traction in China, because China, of course, is the world's country with a well-funded and well-established infrastructure for energy distribution. Still, it's early days yet, but I think that we can see that the hydrogen is being tried out in public transport, hydrogen-driven buses, for example, being experimented in a number of cities. So hydrogen is an emerging and increasingly important agenda in China. Now, as far as nuclear is concerned, of course, China is now the world's largest nuclear program. So the largest number of nuclear power plants being built, and a number of already constructed, and still more being built in the next 10 or even 15 years, is part of China's infrastructure of energy security, rather than depending on import of oil and gas. And also the latest development is that the existing nuclear power is generated by the established nuclear fission. FISS, fusing the atoms. But then China has now recently successfully tried out a much more powerful, but still experimental, kind of production of nuclear energy through nuclear fusion, FUSION. Of course, this is still very early days, because nuclear fusion is really how the sun generates the nuclear energy. So this highlights the fact that China puts a great deal of importance on the energy transition. I think that mainly driven by, as I said, the agenda of quality of life, but also energy security. But here, if I may, just take up a few more minutes to follow up some of the earlier leads which have not been addressed perhaps at all. I refer to water. There's not much discussion, because water security, I think that one of our speakers highlighted it, as likely to become a main source of conflict between countries. For example, China, a lot of the fresh water comes from the Himalayas, and then the Himalayas flow affects the downstream countries like India, Pakistan, and also Myanmar, and then affecting the ecosystems in the downstream. There's still not enough institutions to manage the flow from the upstream countries to the downstream countries, let alone, well, China, of course, is a much water-stressed country. Its water availability is only one-third of the world's average. Average means including the driest regions in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa and so on. It's only one-third. And then additionally, the distribution of water is very uneven. It's too much water down south, historic times, all flooding and so. And there's very little water up north. And most of the water has been polluted, including underground streams. So water is a very, very serious problem. And I agree with the raising this very important topic, because it's likely to grip a number of countries sharing borders and water distribution systems. And also, it's right to concentrate on the trajectory in future on the emerging economies, because according to the OECD, the developing economies by the year 2030 is likely to account for 60% of the world economy. How does the emerging countries address that? Attain that? Well, they grow their industries, because that's the way they grow the economy. An industry depends on energy. So I think this is a big, big agenda, not only for the developing world, but for the whole world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. Actually, you know, what characterizes China is because you actually have the solution. You're a country among the only country actually that we have where actually energy technologies are not driven by markets, but state capitalism. It's like a strategy, energy security-based strategy to say, you know what, renewables are very expensive, we're going to invest massively. You look at the wind industry, 50% of the world's wind turbines are installed in China for the last 15 years, and that has driven the cost down. Same can be said about solar, and the same will likely to be said about electrolysis and so forth. So there is a huge issue on how China is looking at hydrogen technology to try to decarbonize the most polluting industry in the world in terms of numbers. It's steel making, it's manufacturing. So you're like in a huge lab for the rest of the world, for countries in the south, where solutions that you can develop because of your scale may impact positively the developing world. And if you talk about water access, we already have in Morocco water desalination, and it's functioning. Agadir has one of the largest mostly renewable powered desalination projects. We have agricultural projects in the south where actually wind turbines desalinate water for agriculture, and where the farmer can directly pay for the whole process and make it bankable. So thanks to China's effort in the renewable energy sector, but driving down the cost, you provided solutions not only for you, but for the rest of the planet. So that's also important to note. And it's also important to note that the next step would look into how to decarbonize the industry, the Chinese industry, to try and meet those 1.5, 2 degree targets. We don't know, but without China, I doubt that a solution will be possible. Now, let me turn to you, Marius. The floor is yours.
Thank you. In fact, I would like to follow on some of those comments and just take the conversation back up to the geostrategic level for a second, and start by saying we did start the conversation recognizing that we're in an era of great power competition, and some of that competition is currently destructive to energy markets. Our hope certainly is that that competition can turn into positive competition. If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, we look at the role that China is playing, there is an opportunity for the great powers, rather than competing in a negative sense and turning to protectionism and isolationism, competing for the space to be the trilemma titan, to be the transition champion. And we think South Korea, Japan, from a technology point of view, all have a role to play. Germany in their capabilities around CCUS. And so can we have that positive competition? Secondly, I'd like to debunk two other myths that have come up. The one is this idea of strategic autonomy, which really is a veil for a national security perspective that masks an isolationist approach. And we think that really the answer is going to be interdependence. Yes, it is the case that some actors are acting as spoilers that don't see an interdependent world with shared interests and common interests, but we think that trade will continue to play a significant role, and because of that, interdependence is going to be key. And then finally, our colleague from Spain raised this issue of, do we have an energy strategy? And of course, our view is that part of the problem is we're starting the strategic conversation from the wrong perspective. We're starting it from a local perspective, from a national perspective, and we have to perhaps start thinking about a global energy compact to take us beyond commitments and pledges to a more practical, focused strategy. If we are going to wait, and this links to your point, if we're going to wait for the market conditions to be right, we won't find the solution. If we're going to wait for the policymakers and the politicians who are short-termist, we won't find the solutions. So perhaps we need to move, and this is my final point, beyond what we call a PPP to what I would call a CPP, not a private-public partnership, but a community-based PPP, where we take a very local perspective on transition, and as you were saying in Morocco, look at the intersection between agricultural, food, water, and energy at a very local level, and say, what is that transition that is possible in that location, and what role do the various global powers play in enabling those different transitions?
Thank you very much, Marius. That is an for PPP and Fabrice and CPP. You know, I'm putting pressure on your answer, but go ahead. You raised the 10th card for a while.
No big deal. Thank you much. I'd like to enhance what Professor Lange is saying, and I will answer about the CPPPs. I'm absolutely convinced that water and electricity are sister-in-law. They are sister in practice. You don't make any desalination program without huge energy program. You don't treat, transport the water business, I would say the water itself without. And in this kingdom, you don't wait to come from China for that. In the kingdom, for years and years, it has been linked together. The Tanger concession contract awarded to a private company is under water, sanitation, and electricity. Amadeus is working with one company with one invoice on water and electricity, as Rabat, as Tanger, as Casablanca. So, well, you know, South countries have their own solutions and very pragmatic solutions, one. Second is the local authority which drive and which monitor this contract is the Ministry of Interior. This is not the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Water or whatever. It's coming from the top. It's considered since probably more than, I would say 50 years, as a security issue. Water and energy is a security issue since the beginning in the kingdom. So Morocco has been, and I'm very glad to say that because I've been practicing this in this country. They've been inventing some kind of a model in which electricity is paying for water, like it's done in Germany with the Stadtwerke, whereby you have in fact subsidies, not subsidies, but tariff. Yes, the tariff are paying electricity. Tariff is paying also for the infrastructure, and for the sea.
Sorry, that is a myth that was generated by the French water companies in the 1980s, and it is simply wrong.
Okay, we'll have a separate debate on that. Happy to speak about a couple of, I would say, towns I know because we have been practicing on it. And on the CPP, I think the question of coming from the ground is basic. And the PPP is just a formal framework, legal framework, covering some kind of arrangements. If it's not coming from the, I would say, from the ground anyway, it's going to be a failure along the years. And it's going to come very, very fast and soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrice. I just remind you, if it's possible to speak closer to the mic, because sometimes we cannot hear you very well. The floor is yours, Carola.
Thank you very much. Just to add to what was said right now, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Aushausen. I also had, rather than a C, I had an I, institutions. I think we need to include someone else. It's a joint effort. It's a global strategy. And as I mentioned before, concepts such as strategic autonomy are not going to go very far if products come from faraway places by transport means that are not suitable, and we expect to be mirrored by certain standards. Now, transitions are very costly. India is estimated to get to 2070 with zero emissions. They will cost $10 trillion US. That's a lot of money. Not all countries like China can afford to be able to put that much money. And as our colleague was saying, there's a big proportion of the world that live in energy poverty. So there is money from banks, as you were saying. Some projects are not sound. And yesterday I heard someone say, well, private investors will flock if the macroeconomic, political conditions are the right ones, if fiscal incentives are there, if there's the right governance. There were other things, if the legal framework, less bureaucracy. Well, for some less developed countries, that checklist is just basically impossible to fulfill. So we do have to find some joint solutions that go beyond PPP, community, institutions, because as I said earlier, this is a global problem. It affects us all.
Absolutely. I think energy autonomy has some we need to take in consideration also those issues. I mean, you mentioned obviously that Morocco has fused both its electricity and water utility globally on the country. So that was a smart move, I believe, as well. And what we have forgot here is what we learned from COVID disruptions, what we learned from the Suez Canal disruptions is the global supply chain. And we have had an example here in Tanger with a very large wind energy program that Morocco has bundled together to have a wind turbine blade manufacturing plant in Tanger that was dedicated 80% to exports. And then all of a sudden, Siemens say, actually, we're shutting it down because the blades are not long enough. And it's basically because the framework has not been followed through. And when private players come in the market, they don't require local contents. And if we don't try to transfer industries in the country where the resources are, it's obviously, first of all, a security risk, an economic missed opportunity of huge proportion, and it also obviously reduces costs of manufacturing. So that's an issue that I think in a new energy order will have to be addressed one way or another. And I'm sure that China can very much, particularly if the labor is becoming more expensive in China, has a lot to benefit from if it would transfer some of its industries to where the resources is and invest in massive projects. We have seen some of them in infrastructure in Africa. We'd like to see them in renewables. And before I yield the floor to Kateb, I'd like to have your take in a few minutes. We have only 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, I think to follow up on that, this is a main both challenge and an opportunity for China's Belt and Road Initiative, because I think China is learning a very, very big lesson from its early forays in the Belt and Road. There is a concern about accountability, concern about governance, openness, and environmental sustainability. Now, I think that China is learning a lot of lessons from that. It's now working more in tandem with international institutions, including the World Bank and other stakeholders. And one of the main thing, of course, is the energy production in the countries where the Belt and Road traverses. And of course, then, as I said, all the developing countries are trying to grow their economy and to provide employment. So energy demand is a big ticket in these countries. And if not carefully handled, they're going to rely on the easy, supply of coal. So I think that China is taking advantage of that as a big opportunity.
We certainly hope so. We look forward to it. And I think we have to do it sequentially. If we look forward to it, that will be up to China to raise to the global opportunity that a new energy order based on renewables might provide. And it would be certainly one way of leveraging its significant efforts in lowering the costs of renewable energy systems and manufacturing, for that matter. Alexandre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Khalid. I just wanted to get back to something I said previously about the role of markets and planification. Actually, I think that markets are good, should be used where they are good at the micro level, at putting the right incentives for the players within a framework that would be set by policy planners. There is a complementarity between the markets, obviously, and the planification objectives and the strategic objectives. I think China has been doing that with some success in many different areas. In Europe, there was this has been attempted, but there was quite a failure, which is noticeable in the power market, for example. The power market with these very high price spikes, which are caused by failing pricing mechanisms, because Europe moved to a liberalized power market without addressing the root causes, actually, of the supply and demand imbalances. And on the more general level, this applies as well to the nexus between climate change and energy, because I think we have regressed from the Kyoto Protocol, actually. I think the COP15 in Paris, the so-called Paris Agreement, was a capitulation, because before that, in the Kyoto era, we had binding emission caps on all the major countries. And following CAP 15 or COP15 or the Paris Agreement, this was totally dismantled. And now every nation is for itself, and the net zero pledges, blah, blah, 2050, 2060. I think this is a non-cooperative game that ends up actually lowering the standards, and it is a race to the bottom for everyone, and it's not in the interest of energy consumers, of the global transition, and nor in the interest of the fossil fuel country producers and exporters, because they need a high price to transition and to manage the transition as well.
Thank you very much. We're almost reaching the end of the session. You did mention COP and the failure of COP, and asking every individual country to come with its IND. What are your targets and how do you aim to achieve them? And as we are 2, 3 days before the launch of the COP in Egypt, and we're still going after the $100 billion a year investment to enable all these countries to fulfill their pledges, what's your take in a nutshell of what we be able to expect at COP27, knowing that the countries, the financiers, are under stress because of their own energy security issues and some large amounts of funds that are dedicated to subsidizing their natural gas supplies, such as Germany, 200 billion. So, you know, we kind of look at a situation that is very dynamic.
This is very true, actually. Yes, I do expect that most of the rich companies come with certain budget allocated for renewable energy, for real renewable energy, on a win-win situation. It's not a matter of having power generated in a country and just exported to the other country. No, we need to go for a win-win situation. We have to develop the developing countries as well and upgrade their living expenses by putting more investments on their land, taking into consideration the optimum or the economy of scale, having such projects in their countries, availing job opportunities that would enable poor people to live in acceptable conditions, not to put more burdens on their shoulders by increasing the food prices. So I do expect having more investments in such event. Also, let me focus on the Suez Canal as a strategic passage for the maritime industry, and it might have been known to everybody now that logistics is the name of the game, simply. So Suez Canal is playing an important role in this, and we have seen the impacts actually during this few days crisis, where it was locked for 3-4 days. So we have to improve also and secure the passage of Suez Canal to serve the world, not to serve only Egypt, to serve the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That leads me to the conclusion of this session. Basically, if, in a nutshell, we're going to resume the discussions we had. We looked at the current situation and the crisis, energy crisis, and to try to understand how a new energy order could be inspired by the old energy order. And you know, when we're confronted to something we don't understand, we tend to look back at history and try to see, you know, how things are being resolved, you know, and obviously war is part of the game. And I tried to see whether the role of the United States, incumbent power on energy, securing global energy supplies, and the rising power of China coming up with renewable energies and a variety of technologies that it would make more affordable. I tried to see whether China would or try to gain some strategic leverage on the old energy supply routes. And I think you've been quite adamant to say that is not really the strategy that China, of course you're not engaging your government on your answer, but China looks at beyond the old energy order, and that's fairly optimistic for all of us and for the energy transition. We tried to get a take from different regions of the world, and I tried to get Elena from Spain to talk a little bit, and she did not have time to really address this issue, something we did not address on this panel, which is the technology and the demand side, which particularly in an era of supply bottlenecks and supply cuts, can make a difference, because the best energy is the energy we don't use. And I think that is something that was a little bit missing in our conversation. We did address, you know, geopolitical hurdles within regional blocks, and we realized that it was complex on a geopolitical situation to get a common view. We also saw that it's kind of a race to the bottom when you're going after fossil fuel supplies on a short-term basis, and we realized that this hasn't necessarily led, but we're early in the process, into long-term solutions. Everybody is looking at the short-term. We looked at technologies that could be applied, such as nuclear, and we realized that we're confronted to some limitations in the implementation. We talk about proliferation, weaponizing of nuclear power plants, and the rollout of this technology that will be, postponing its operation for many, many years, if, almost decades, if not more. So we're not sure we can rely on that. We discussed also the food security situation and the link between energy, water, and food. I believe Morocco is kind of an example of that. We also discussed, as we talk about Morocco, on the current crisis on food for security regarding the fertilizer issues. We realized that one of the main feedstock, ammonia, relies on natural gas, and that's one of the reasons also why models can be set up to try to secure a transition where you have a market case and where you have the resource. But of course, the investments are so big that you need to bridge a gap for countries and companies that don't have the capacity to invest so much into an energy transition. So we can see perhaps emerging models between Australia and Japan to try have a feed-in tariff for green hydrogen. Perhaps Europe will look into this, but this is obviously a wish. We don't know how fast this can be implemented. We've seen also how public-private partnerships and the industry and how this configuration would be one way of deploying large-scale renewables. We also saw the limitation of and the influence of different energy technologies. We've seen the example of nuclear in the UK and renewables that are much cheaper to be delivered in the UK, but expensive renewables, because they rely on nuclear power and a range of other considerations, are being prioritized at this stage. There is still no offtake agreement for this project, for example. With investors behind it, we have Saudi Arabia that is backing this project, but that will be a debate for another time. We've seen how companies are adapting, trying to anticipate those changes, such as ENGIE, and the comments on nuclear were interesting for that matter. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we looked at the attitude of oil and gas producers that are willing to take risks to make sure that they can impact the price of oil and gas. We also realized that the current crisis may be a conjunctural crisis because of Europe's dependency on natural gas for its transition. We discussed also the transition of green hydrogen, not using colors, and the risk that it entails. We also looked at the environmental problematic of natural gas. We did not talk too much about shale gas and the methane emissions. We talked about carbon capture and storage limitations, if I may say, or the problems of how reliable this technology is, how expensive, how affordable, rather, it will be. So I think that pretty much, if I have not forgotten any other issue, I think we covered most of the topics in brainstorming, actually, what would be possibly a future pathway to a new energy order that we hope will be much more inclusive. We talked about industry transfers, technology transfer in the Global South being probably one of the biggest elephants in the room that we have not addressed effectively, because that's where not only the solution is, and that's where the emerging problem will come from if their needs are not addressed properly. So I think with that, I'd like to thank you very much for attending this session. And I look forward to be able to follow up on these critical strategic issues in the future. And I thank you very much for your patience. And I'd like, please, to give a round of applause for our speakers and appreciate very much their input in this panel. Thank you.